Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for your patience as we kind of figured out how to deal with the late lunch situation upstairs in the cafeteria. I'm Ann Neelon. I'm Professor Emeritus at Murray State University, which is about 3 hours south west of here. And I've driven up here partly because I have a connection with Eamon. I'm not an official Irish studies scholar. I am somebody but I have taught a lot of English and creative writing. That's my specialty. And Eamon and I were on a panel together on Writing the Great Hunger at the Associated Writing Conference, and I sort of got pulled in through that. And I've always taught a lot of Irish literature and done a lot of issues of the journal I used to run on Irish matters. So that's me. And today we're really featuring these wonderful people over there. And, you've probably heard that little line from Dodge City, before the railroad barons, the Irish workers and the barons say, well, it takes all kinds of men to make a railroad. And the Irish say, no, sir, just us Irish. And I think that took a few Chinese as well. But now we have we're going to get the transcontinental glimmering railroad here from the women's point of view. What have Irish women contributed to Irish American literature? So let me just give you a little bit of information on each presenter, and I'm going to go in the order of presentation, which is alphabetical. Okay, so Linda Dowling Almeida is a graduate of Boston College and NYU. She has taught Irish American literature, history, and oral history for more than 20 years at Glucksman Ireland House, NYU, specializing in immigration. And thanks so much to Glucksman House for all those wonderful productions it sends out to those of us in the hinterlands. I really appreciate it. I think next up, am I right? Yes, we've got Betsy Dougherty, who was hired and mentored. Whoops, I just missed something here. An associate professor at Southern Illinois University-Carbondale, which is very close to here, as you all know. Betsy Dougherty was hired and mentored by Charlie Fanning. She won the 2023 College of Liberal Arts tenure track Excellence in Teaching Award. Her book, Narrating Irish Female Development, 1916-2018, is forthcoming from Edinburgh University Press. And it has the most gorgeous cover I've practically ever seen. It's really beautiful. I wish we could project it up there. And then finally, we've got Sally Barr, Ebest, Professor Emeritus, Department of English here at you all pronounce it UMSL, right? Co-editor of Too Smart to Be Sentimental, Essays on Irish American Women Writers, author also of The Banshees, A Literary History of Irish American Women Writers. She's currently working on autobiographies of Irish American Catholic women. And I think she's been very involved in this conference, and we owe her some kudos for all her contributions here. So I am very happily going to turn over the floor to Linda here.
Hey, well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I've known Charlie for many, many years, and I use his book on fiction like a Bible. So it was a very easy yes when Eamon wrote to ask if I'd want to participate in this conference day. So let me begin. As the saying goes, clothes make the man, or in this case, the woman. I'm not ordinarily someone who follows fashion, but about 5 or 6 years ago, I was visiting my sister in Minneapolis and passed a building with a woman's name etched prominently in the stone facade. It read Ellen C. Quinlan. You can see it up there on the top. I was taken aback because you don't often see a female name adorning a building on a prominent city street. I investigated Miss Quinlan and began to do some background research on her and the building. She was a prominent women's clothing buyer and retailer in the Midwest for almost the first half of the 20th century. Her story stays with me and sparked the paper I'm presenting today. While Irish women have historically worked in the textile trades in America and in Ireland for centuries, most often we associate them with the 19th century East Coast factories. Rarely do we place Irish women on either side of the Atlantic in the salons of haute couture, at least not 100 years ago. Ms. Quinlan seemed to be an anomaly. However, my investigation revealed that Irish women in America had been influential in fashion and retail for decades in the 20th century, and that clothing has been an important link to Irish-American female mobility, not just in terms of employment, but in how they presented themselves to the world. In some ways, an awareness of clothing and how to dress could be compared to the influence that working in the homes of middle-class Americans had on female Irish domestics and their aspirations for their families. The two largest employers of Irish immigrant women from the famine period to about 1900 were textile mills and the urban families of the American middle class. Just to give you some numbers, in 1836, 7,000 women were employed in the mills of Lowell, New England. Fewer than 4% were immigrants. In 1860, 61.8% were immigrants, most of whom were Irish. According to Hausia Diner, mill work was the choice of desperation for Irish women. Domestic work was preferred despite the long hours and hard physical labor for the room and board it offered and the chance to save money, a good portion of which was routinely sent home to family in Ireland. Janet Nolan tells us that for the last half of the 19th century and early 20th century, more than one half of all Irish women in the United States worked as domestic servants. As the 20th century begins, the Irish are replaced by Italians and Eastern Europeans in the textile factories. But in a tangential field, 33.8% of all seamstresses and dressmakers in the U.S. are Irish immigrants. The needle trades, as this work is identified, offered women not only work outside the home, but opportunities to contribute to their household income while they raised a family. Some women even opened their own dress shops or millinery businesses. A 1909 story found in the Miltonian of Milton, Pennsylvania reveals, quote, "The Irish-American woman dressmaker is the equal of the French man dressmaker," said a Parisian at a tea in New York. "Her skill amazes me. It is no wonder she gets on." The history of Irish immigrant women in the American workplace tells us they sought independence as well as an income. By the 1890s, half of all Irish immigrants were young women. They could travel, live, work, and entertain themselves without a chaperone. Only 16% of all Irish immigrants in the U.S. between 1887 and 1900 were married. And between 1848 and 1900, about $250 million crossed the Atlantic to Ireland in cash or passage from Irish immigrants in North America. When these women did marry, they actively discouraged their daughters from entering service or factories. Mothers pushed their daughters and sons to pursue an education. Janet Nolan tells us that many of these daughters became the teachers for generations of children in the early 20th century. In fact, by 1900, Irish Americans made up the largest ethnic bloc of public school teachers in San Francisco, Boston, and Chicago. And this doesn't include the large number of Irish and Irish American nuns teaching in parish schools. Education could also include trade school training. In 1904, the Massachusetts Association of Women Workers opened the Boston Trade School for Girls, the first state-aided industrial school in the state. The school prepared young women aged 14 to 25 for work outside the home. Among the more popularly enrolled courses were dressmaking and millinery, as opposed to machine work or domestic skills. Most of the students were from middle-class families, many the children of Irish and single mothers and immigrants who wanted more for their daughters than entry-level unskilled labor. Even though a portion of the curriculum focused on domestic life skills to prepare students for what was presumed to be their eventual role as wife and mother, according to historian Wendy Gamber, the goal for the students and families was not just to prepare them for life as a homemaker. These families, particularly Irish parents, privileged self-support over preparation for home life. In addition to trade school, sewing skills were taught in at least some public schools, according to the prefaces of needlework primers from 1892, 1910, 1917, and 1924. The role of Irish women in the class mobility of the Irish in American society is well known. Young domestics carried the lessons of social etiquette, diet, decorating, and drawing room manners into their homes, which many historians believe accelerated the transition of the Irish from the working classes to the middle class. Included in that introduction to the middle class was how to dress. Indeed, newspaper accounts and fiction are filled with anecdotes of young Irish girls imitating the dress and mannerisms of their mistresses. Marianne Sadler, in a popular 1861 story about a fictional domestic named Bessie Conway, describes a wayward co-worker of Bessie named Sally, both young women Irish immigrants. Sally is dressed to go out, and Bessie notices, quote, the various gewgaws which went to make up Sally's flaunting attire. Sally defies their employer and refuses to stay in on her night off. Her boss fires her and says, "I will pay you what I owe you." In fact, she owed Sally nothing. Her last month's wages hung on the back of her head in the shape of a stylish bonnet. In this example, Miss Sadler is warning her readers that young, innocent Irish women can get caught up in the dangerous independence and material consumerism of America. But maybe the young immigrant just wants to belong and feels the egalitarian pull of America to dress just as well as her employer does and expresses her right to go out. Other American critics push back on the perceived boldness of the Irish servant girl and her sometimes impertinent relationship with her mistress. In this slide, you can see is a famous cartoon by Frederick Auber called the Irish Declaration of Independence, published in Puck on May 9, 1883. In it, you see a powerfully built domestic wearing a loud dress with shamrocks and an apron in clownish imitation of her employer. She's shaking her fist at her mistress. The dainty, refined woman is cowering in the corner of her kitchen, begging the biddy to stop yelling. In another from 1882, a group of rowdy Irish domestics and police officers, a popular occupation for Irish men of the time, are sitting in their employer's drawing room, socializing in imitation of their social superiors. Again, the tone of the image is mocking. Just who do they think they are, pretending to belong? And you can see in the top left corner there, the family looking in on the scene. What do we make of these examples? First, Irish women were known for their outspoken behavior and had a reputation for challenging their employers. Second, clearly the Irish were observing and imitating the lifestyle of their middle-class bosses. But the American middle class apparently did not consider the behavior flattering. Rather, the brashness of the Irish and their eagerness to become American was clearly threatening. Not only had they invaded the country, taken over urban politics and civil service, they were in the living in the homes of American families and caring for their children. The Irish are making their presence felt, but were yet to be fully accepted. In a story set a few decades later, Mary Doyle Curran uses clothing to demonstrate a futile attempt for acceptance by one young Irish-American woman in her novel, The Parish and the Hill. Hannah had been the most beautiful girl in Irish Parish. She sewed beautifully and had the finest clothes of any girl in Irish Parish. She modeled them after the clothes she saw on the ladies of Money Hole Hill, which was where the rich Yankee Protestants family lived. Hannah married into one of those families, thinking she had escaped her shanty Irish background, but was not accepted. Quote, "God knows I had no desire to remain Irish, but the in-laws saw to it I could be nothing else." Elizabeth Quinlan, the retailer I mentioned earlier, was born in 1863 to Irish immigrants, and her mother was a domestic before the family opened an ocean store in Minnesota. Neither Elizabeth nor her sisters ever went into service, and Elizabeth Quinlan had no skills as a seamstress, but she had a good eye for fashion and a talent for selling and marketing. In 1894, a colleague named Fred Young, convinced her to join him in opening a store where they could be their own bosses. While some custom dressmakers like Anna Dunleavy in Cincinnati, Ohio, reportedly employed 500 seamstresses and lace makers in the early 1900s, there was a concurrent movement in the country toward ready-to-wear clothes. Quinlan and Young pioneered the concept in the Midwest. Their first store was called Fred D. Young & Company. Elizabeth was one of the first female buyers in the United States, traveling several times a year to bring Paris couture fashions back to her beloved Midwest, where Young & Company seamstresses would recreate the styles for their American customers. 10 years into their venture, Young became ill and died in 1911. Quinlan bought his share of the business and carried on a loan, calling the store Young Quinlan. Her experience on shopping trips in the U.S. and Europe opened her eyes to the world of luxury and fashion that she absorbed and brought back to Minneapolis, much like the young domestics bringing middle-class Moors into their family homes. Quinlan opened the store I saw on Nicollet Avenue on March 17th, 1926. Her 5-story building was a luxury experience offering everything a woman could want, from dresses to foundation garments, jewelry and perfume, and museum-quality display cases, a tea room, and the first underground parking lot in the country, which could hold up to 250 cars, all under one roof. Its opening drew 15,000 shoppers. Here she is on opening night. While Quinlan was bringing couture fashion and luxury to Minnesota, a budding Irish-born editor named Carmel White was about to make her mark in fashion journalism. Born in 1887 in Dalkey outside Dublin to Annie and Peter White, her father died at the age of 43 as he was about to manage the Irish Village in the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. While still in mourning, Carmel's mother quickly took the mantle meant for her husband and sailed to America without her children. The exhibit was wildly successful. When the fair closed, White arranged to manage the craft store that financiers for the exhibit opened to bring Irish crafts to the public. A stylish, social woman, Mrs. White was said to be, very media and society savvy, hosting popular parties and charming the likes of Chicago's artists, actors, and writers, and was a particular favorite of the columnist Peter Finlay Dunn. The store was a hit and soon expanded to larger quarters, offering Irish products and ultimately dressmaking services. The latter became important to White because while in Paris for the couture shows she frequented for the boutique, she was offered the opportunity to buy a successful custom dressmaking business in Manhattan from two sisters who owned it and wanted to retire. By 1904, White left Chicago and was in Manhattan running the TM and JM Foxing boutique. With very little experience, White learned the dress business and grew the Fox firm with a sure hand. By 1910, she had become quite a force in the business, maintaining and building the client and cachet of the shop the Fox sisters began. Annie White dragged her daughter Carmel into the family business. Mother and daughter were continually at odds, but Carmel's time in the dress store gave her a behind-the-scenes tutorial on clothing construction, fabric, styling, and pricing, as well as experience running the myriad demands of a multifaceted business. On shopping trips with her mother, Carmel and her sister Christine were tasked with copying the new styles they saw in the Paris designer shows. Her social connections in New York resulted in an opportunity to provide notes on one of the Paris collections for a columnist who was too ill to attend himself. The columnist loved Carmel's input and wrote her a letter of introduction to Edna Chase, editor of Vogue, and White was on her way. Carmel's tenure at Vogue began in 1921. At the time, it had the highest circulation of all the fashion publications in the country and was the Bible for dressing well. So conscious of the world she was entering, Carmel recalled, "I got myself up to kill, carefully planning her wardrobe with a dress from a famous French designer for her first day on the job." Vogue employees had a strict dress code requiring hats, white gloves, and silk stockings. Quinlan's staff in Minneapolis had to dress in black and white on the floor of the store and commute to and from work wearing a hat and gloves. Appearances were important. So during the 1920s, both these Irish Catholic women, Quinlan in particular, were in leadership roles in the world of American fashion, with the power to influence the style and dress choices of women across the country, either at the point of sale or in the pages of fashion magazines. Quinlan influenced not only Minneapolis fashion, but was an important business, society, and arts leader in her community. When asked about her store, Quinlan said it had become, quote, a part of the social and economic life of the community. It has helped the community realize some of its aspirations for more beautiful living, and so it has made its contributions towards forming the standards of business and appropriateness. She loved to bring theater back to her hometown and once hosted the Abbey Players on a tour of the U.S. In addition to clothes, it was Quinlan's dream to bring the glamour of New York and Paris back to her hometown. She retired in the mid-1940s, sold her store, and died shortly thereafter. White, who did not marry until her late 30s, dropped her maiden name, or else she would have been Carmel White Snow when she wed. After more than a decade at Vogue, Carmel Snow broke her contract and jumped ship to Harper's Bazaar in 1935, where she felt she had more freedom and control as editor. She created a legacy there that was legendary. Snow was Anna Wintour before Anna Wintour. So betrayed felt Condé Nast, the powerful publisher and Snow's mentor at Vogue, that he never spoke to her again. Snow transformed fashion editing, taking photo shoots outdoors and being the first to publish action as opposed to static pose shots and fashion spreads, creating a lively, more dynamic publication. She could make or break a career and was said to christen Christian Dior's post-war collection, The New Look, in 1947, which resurrected French couture. Glenn Close portrayed her in a recent cable television series called The New Look. Like Quinlan, Snow brought her readers high culture as well as haute couture, inviting writers like Frank O'Connor, Catherine Ann Porter, Evelyn Waugh, and an unknown Truman Capote to publish their stories. Her intention was to serve well-dressed women and well-dressed minds. Carmel Snow ran Harper's Bazaar until 1957, when her niece Nancy became editor. Snow died 4 years later. By the 1950s, the Irish were beginning to come into their own in the U.S. after the Depression and World War II. They had served their country admirably and were climbing up the social and economic ladder. Enter a young congressman from Massachusetts, with a glamorous wife and energetic, photogenic sisters. Jack Kennedy's campaigns for Congress and the Senate and ultimately the White House have been covered extensively. But for our review today, consider the Tea Party strategy employed by his Senate campaign in 1952. Organized by his cousin Polly Fitzgerald, Kennedy's family encouraged local women to host a series of tea parties across Massachusetts and ultimately across the country, inviting women of all socioeconomic strata, ethnicities, and races to join the Kennedy Women's Social League, where they could meet Rose, Eunice, Jean, and Pat, and ultimately candidate Jack. The events were a huge success, and according to some political experts, one of the chief reasons behind Kennedy's statewide victory. Women, 6,000 in number, according to one article, stand patiently in the receiving line. Women in hats and gloves, hoping to share the Kennedy glamour. The family were arguably royalty even then, with a wealthy father and time spent in the court of King James when Joseph Kennedy Sr. was U.S. ambassador to the UK from 1938 to 1940. One scholar joked, "I think every Irish Catholic mother in the room who had a single daughter had ideas before Kennedy married Jacqueline Bouvier in 1953. It was social and political genius to engage the female members of Kennedy's family to mobilize the female vote. Associating with the Kennedys was aspirational, and Kennedy and his sisters made it a point to spend time with every woman who attended the event. One staffer recalled Kennedy standing to greet guests until 1 o'clock in the morning, on many occasions. When Kennedy was elected president, he and his wife Jackie became international superstars. We all know the story of Camelot. For two young people with roots in the famine, they embodied the rise of the Irish from the slums of the East Coast to the highest levels of society and politics in America. And they looked the part, well-dressed and elegant. Jackie, despite her French name, had 8 great-great-grandparents and 2 great-grandparents born in Ireland. JFK's roots are undisputed on both sides of his family. But in 1960, they represented America. Jackie's wardrobe was the topic of society pages and the op-eds. What she wore made headlines and influenced the way women in America dressed. When she started to wear pillbox hats, every woman in America wanted to own one. Irish women were no longer being ridiculed for their dress. Irish Catholic First Lady was a trendsetter. What a turnaround from the days of Puck. But Mrs. Kennedy used fashion to make a statement about herself, her husband, her family, and her country. She carefully picked colors to represent the occasion. She knew what photographed well from any angle, including hats, and she picked outfits that were comfortable, movable, and appropriate for the event. It was said she created an American look of youth, vigor, and not a little glamour. In the novel The Pink Suit, one of the characters dismisses a comment that the First Lady will look pretty in an outfit. Quote, "This isn't about what is pretty, it's about perfection. The First Lady is the best of us. She's who we all aspire to be. She must be perfect at all times." It would be easy to dismiss her interest in clothes and fashion as superficial, but we should keep in mind that she also led the effort to restore the White House to its former glory and led a nationwide search to locate furniture and art that had gone missing over decades of administrations and renovations. Her restoration effort was informed by historical research and period scholarship. She conducted a televised tour of the White House on February 14, 1962, to explain the project as vital to preserving the history of the White House. It was broadcast by all 3 networks. A total of 56 million people tuned in, more than had visited the White House in its entire history up to that point. Novelist Nicole Kelby said in a book talk in an essay that in an essay contest she entered as a young woman, Jackie Kennedy admitted that she wanted to be the art director of the 20th century. For 3 years, she arguably did just that from Washington. Early in JFK's term, critics complained about the expense and the source of Mrs. Kennedy's clothes. She was not wearing enough made-in-America outfits. Mrs. Kennedy solved that dilemma by obtaining French designs like Chanel suits and having them handmade in the U.S. Her go-to atelier was Chez Neelon in New York City. Run by 2 eccentric socialites, they began the dressmaking establishment, bringing the designs of the French one right back to America, copying the details of the new fashions immediately after viewing them, and then turning the illustrations over to their seamstresses on Park Avenue. After the garment was completed in the back workroom, a Chez Neelon label was sewn into the lining. An American-made outfit was sold to the wealthy women of Manhattan, including the First Lady. Chez Neelon made the famous pink suit Jackie wore to Dallas the weekend JFK was assassinated. Nicole Kelby brings the creation of that suit to life in The Pink Suit, an historical novel that centers on a young Irish immigrant named Kate, who puts the suit together for the wife, the nickname the ladies in Chez Neelon give to Mrs. Kennedy. Despite the technological progress of the textile industry, the Chanel suit in question was hand-sewn over hours of backbreaking work by Kate. This following passage that really got me thinking about the history of textiles and dressmaking among Irish-American women. Quote, "By Friday, it was snowing pink in the back workroom. The boucle did not just shed, it came undone. Boucle means to curl in French. When Kate touched her hair, the pink hid in her bangs. If she rubbed her eyes, it hung in her lashes. It made her sneeze, made her cough, made her itch. It had the scent of old sheep and coal fires. Pink tumbled toward the floor, catching on her nylons, hanging on her shoes. Pink had worked its way into cups of tea. Tiny puffs floated on top of thick cream." This was 1963. Compare this passage to Harriet Farley describing the working environment in Lowell in 1843. She describes the carding room, where the cotton flies most and the girls get the dirtiest, the disagreeable smells of the sizing or starching room, the confinement of the weavers, spinners, and doffers, and their ear-wringing, foot-swelling, hand-enlarging, skin-staining labor from 5 in the morning until 7 at night. So much had changed and yet remained the same. Kate's client may have been more famous and Irish, and the clothes more glamorous, but the work was daunting and anonymous. For Kate, quote, simple dress could take 100 hours to make. A beaded gown could run over 1,000, sometimes 2, but she never met the clients. The fictional Kate is a composite of 2 Irish women who worked for Shane Anon and actually did complete the pink suit by hand. With the election of Kennedy to the White House, the Irish had become fully integrated to American culture and society. They had reached the top of the ladder politically. By the 1970s, they were the best educated and most financially successful of any immigrant group besides Jewish Americans. It was a remarkable journey from their post-famine ancestors. But immigrants like the fictional Kate and the 2 women upon whom her character is based still entered at the bottom of the ladder and sent money home to their families like women did in the 1800s. Yet they too dreamed of more. Kate believes that, quote, with a needle and thread in her hand, anything was possible. My mother used to tell me to dress for the job you want, not the one you have. Keeping this dress theme going, I think you can say that applies here too. All the women highlighted in this paper, not just Elizabeth Quinlan, the Whites, Carmel Snow, or Jackie Kennedy, wanted something more for their families, for themselves and their families. They signaled that ambition by how they presented themselves to the world. They set examples for generations of women and men to, if not follow, then at least respect and admire. Thank you.
It is a privilege to speak at this gathering honoring Charlie Fanning, though I do feel a bit out of place as my work is on Irish rather than Irish-American women writers. However, my talk today is inspired by an observation made by Charlie about Irish-American women's realist fictions, which I adapt to apply to Irish women's postmodern fictions, and which I hope will have salience for Irish Americans' recent work as well. Charlie's insight about Irish American literature from a 1980 article on Elizabeth Cullinan's 1970 novel, House of Gold, is that there is a recurrent conjunction of characterization and symbolism, the dominant mother who controls a house that also functions as a central organizing symbol. As Charlie argues, this mother becomes a securely located woman of the house, with the house in question a central resonant symbol of great emotional power and a place of refuge from the new society's strangeness and dangers. He quotes a popular late 19th century conduct book by Father Bernard J. O'Reilly, The Mirror of True Womanhood, a book of instruction for women in the world. The home is the sacred sphere within which God has appointed that women should exercise their sway, that most blessed kingdom which it is in their power to create, and over which the author of every most perfect gift will enable them to reign with an influence as undisputed as it may be boundless for all good. Catholic women are exhorted to make of their abode a paradise by imitating Christ and his mother and providing an example of selflessness, piety, and hospitality for husband and children. This maternal role as woman of the house is both a continuation of and a break from the role played by women in Ireland. Fanning notes O'Reilly's praise for the traditional Irish home, where the traditional values are inculcated by the mother in her teaching role as the family's spiritual and emotional guide. Yet these traditional Irish homes were often under threat from colonialism, most tragically during the famine, and could often only be symbolically rebuilt after emigration to the United States. It is no wonder that the mother figure in House of Gold so fiercely cherishes her house, recasting it as a house of gold, even though it is a cramped and shabby place close to the railroad tracks. And she cherishes it because it is the house that embodies Mrs. Devlin's tenuous respectability. Similarly, the leader of the newly post-colonial Ireland would perpetuate a vision of that country in which laughing maidens would come to occupy their own cozy homesteads. The specter of colonial dispossession haunted those Irish who stayed, as well as those who left. I want to just suggest a few ways of thinking about Irish literary houses. The first is, I think, suggested in Charlie's article. The home isn't just dominated by the mother, it comes to symbolize the mother and vice versa. Almost inevitably, the home and the mother symbolize Ireland as well. The fortress mentality and cultural stagnancy of early post-colonial Ireland, a place of tenuous respectability, despite its cramped and shabby social realities, is evident in this metaphor. The second is suggested by my own forthcoming work on Irish female developmental narratives, which is the difficulty that most Irish women writers have in imagining the young Irish female child becoming a woman of the house. This is true during all periods of Ireland's post-colonial history, but it becomes foregrounded in post-1990 narratives. The third is the house as a physical thing in the narrative, an object which becomes legible only when it no longer works. That is, I'm thinking in terms of the basic insight of thing theory. And the fourth is my emerging scholarly interest in the ways in which physical spaces structure narratives. By examining postmodern fictions by Anne Enright, Claire Keegan, Edna O'Brien, and Elise Gwivney, I want to leave you with some suggestive examples of the ways houses and other dwellings work in recent narratives by Irish women. Anne Enright's work is not easily summarized, but a consistent preoccupation of her fictions is the haunting of post-1990s Ireland by its past. That is, the woman of the house is often a specter haunting the houses of her strenuously, self-consciously modern Irish female subjects. In The Gathering, each of 3 generations of women is associated with a particular house, containing her subjectivity and her secret. Moreover, each of these 3 houses represents a particular phase in Irish postcolonial history. Veronica Hegarty's grandmother Ada at first appears to be a powerful woman of the house, but her house is not in fact hers. Rather, it belongs to Nugent, who, because he owns the house, also believes himself to own the children, Ada's grandchildren, who pass through it. And some of you know that Nugent's sense of ownership over Ada's grandchildren leads him to sexually abuse at least one of those children. Likewise, in the early post-colonial period, ownership of Irish women and children was transferred to a triumphalist generation of Irish men, confirming their new ownership of Ireland itself. In Edna O'Brien's 1962 novel, The Lonely Girl, the protagonist's father gathers up a posse to return her to the family home, telling her and her lover that we won our fight for freedom. It's our country now. In The Gathering, the 3 grandchildren are exiles in Ada's house and thus neither inside nor outside it. They are not Ada's children, and her house is not her house. Houses are central metaphors of insideness and outsideness for Enright, and they are both wombs and antigonal tombs. Veronica's childhood home takes a particular shape because her mother has been assigned a particular job, producer of citizen sons. Indeed, this remains a constitutionally prescribed role. The referendum to remove it from the Constitution just failed. She produces a multitude of children at the cost of her own physical and mental health and the safety of her children, 3 of whom are exiled to Ada's house because there are too many at home. Accordingly, the Hegarty family home is misshapen, all extension and no house, expanding to accommodate the growing family, but also reflecting its narrowness. The house's extensions frequently impede egress, and as Susan Cahill argues, rooms do not stay discrete. The outside of the house becomes part of the inside. Veronica's adult home, on the other hand, has no inside nor outside, the rooms opening into each other so nicely, such that Veronica herself becomes a ghost floating from room to room, along with the ghosts of her honored and dishonored dead. If the colonial, i.e. pre-1923, early post-colonial, 1923 to 1960, and mid-post-colonial, 1960 to 1990, regimes, symbolized by, and indeed contained within domestic spaces, are unbearable for the Irish female subject. So too is the contemporary, which I like to think of as the post-colonial era. Of course, this is true in part because the metaphoric rooms containing these earlier times still exist in the Irish house, their doors often ajar. Eventually, Veronica resorts to driving around in her car, unable to occupy her own haunted house, and then at the end of the novel moves into an airport hotel. If the corporate hotel is, as Robbie Moore argues, an emblem of modernity, structuring intimate encounters with the impersonal and the anonymous, representing a radically new mode of experience, the airport hotel is an emblem of postmodernity, a radically atopian, no-place space, expressing Veronica's permanent liminality. The typical, very temporary inhabitant of an airport hotel is a passenger about to embark or recently disembarked on their way to somewhere else. Moreover, the space of this airport hotel structures Veronica's narrative, which she writes, revises, revokes, renounces, and then writes again. The airport hotel room is a space, then, of narration. More than one Irish literary work concludes with its protagonist in a hotel room, the basis for an article I hope soon to write, and writes other motifs in the gathering. The haunted family house and the wandering car are also found in other texts. Edna O'Brien's novel Down by the River, a fictionalization of the X case, is replete with images of keys, locks, and houses, symbolizing the attempt of the young abjected protagonist to make her way back within the family home and the margins of Irish subjectivity, to return to becoming an invisible, innocent, and indeed ungendered Irish daughter, rather than a violated and thus supposedly complicit female subject. When Mary McNamara, who is pregnant, stays with a friend's family to keep her safe from her father's predations, she loses their house key and is reprimanded by the woman of the house, who regrets having let her in. Likewise, when she runs away from home, the young man who shelters her gives her access to a key, but she cannot bring herself to request it at the chemist's. Mary is no longer to be allowed in, even as she is being required to house a fetus against her will. However, Mary ultimately accepts the domestic ideology of Ireland. The novel ends with her seeking to return to the family house, currently empty and covered with Joycean snow, but waiting for life to come back, in the way she is waiting for the face to materialize, the face that she will sing the words to, the face of the athletic youth who will bring her back to her family's cozy homestead. It's difficult to choose homelessness, even when home is unbearable. Indeed, most often in Irish female developmental narratives, an alternative family home must be built for the maturing subject, and as well, the maturing female subject must find a way to become mobile. The work of Claire Keegan exemplifies this. Her story, Men and Women, begins with the sentence, "My father takes me places," because the only women who drive are a Protestant woman in the town and a rough woman behind the hill who drives a tractor, whom the child narrator thinks of as part man, part woman. However, the narrator's mother has been learning to drive in secret, and when her father humiliates his wife at a local dance by carrying on with another woman, she and the narrator refuse in turn to open the gate so he can drive the car through it. When he gets out of the car to open the gate himself, the narrator's mother drives the car through it. Small act of feminist rebellion. Keegan's story emphasizes that both the woman of the house and her female children are subordinate. Thus, Irish female maturation functions as a kind of permanent liminality. Early in the story, the narrator imagines that when she is grown, she could sit beside the fire and be called up to dinner and draw triangles and lick the nubs of special pencils, sit behind the wheel of a car and have someone open gates that I could drive through. But this is a male maturation story, the only one that can be imagined, and it is thus a fantasy, as even the narrator subconsciously knows. She has asked her mother why her father and brother, also a minor, don't do anything in the house, and her mother replies that they are men. The narrator already understands that becoming the woman of the house does not equal adult maturity. After her mother drives the car through the gate, the girl realizes there is no Santa Claus. Her childish and unrealistic fantasies of her future are dispelled when she can replace them with a true rite of passage, propelled by her mother's act of feminist resistance. Yet her family's car has no working handbrake, so it constantly slides backwards. An acknowledgement of the continued salience of patriarchy in modern Ireland. Another Keegan story, Foster, and some of you may have seen the film adaptation, and Colleen Kewen, it's great. Another Keegan story, Foster, illustrates the necessity of the developing Irish female subjects finding an alternative family home to grow up in. In these developmental narratives, generally, a foreign and/or queer avunculate must be built to nurture the female child. Irish female maturation often takes place in the space of the convent school rather than the family house. Keegan's story evokes an important social custom in pre-colonial Ireland, despite being set in 1981. In the story, a young nameless girl is sent away to the home of distant relatives because of the compulsory generation imposed on Irish women. The girl wonders if the new baby will be a boy or a girl this time, though she knows her mother wants neither. In a home with many unwanted children, the protagonist isn't individuated. Her father calls her this girl and this one, while her foster parents, the Kinselas, immediately name her child, Gerline, Longlegs, and Petal. Whether infertile or able to control their fertility, the Kinselas' childlessness means they cherish children. As Sylvie Mikowski argues, most of the things the little girl notices in the Kinselas' house point out what is missing or amiss in her own family home. The strain of so many children has made the protagonist's house chaotic and abusive. Paradoxically, the endless compulsory generation of the protagonist's mother forces the protagonist out of the family home. She finds a maternal figure, a genuine woman of the house, only in another place. The importance of mobility and of leaving one's house to Irish female development is also evident in Elise Gwibney's 1998 novel, The Dancers Dancing, set in 1972. Not only does her mother have career aspirations for Orla, the novel's protagonist, but she speaks confidently of Orla's future as a lady driver. Though defined as the woman of the house, Elizabeth does in fact have a paying job, though one that functions as an extension of her prescribed role. She takes in boarders. The status-conscious Orla never mentions her mother's job. She experiences her home's transformation into a boarding house as the outside coming inside, the family home now resembling a shop or some public place. But when Orla goes to the Gaeltacht for Irish language school, she is herself a boarder. An outsider in another family's house while at the school, Orla is both an insider and outsider in the school's location, Tubber. Orla is a Dubliner coming to Tubber from outside, but she is also a Tubber insider because the village is her paternal family's home place. Initially, Orla is embarrassed by her connection to Tubber, but by the end of the novel, she has felt the consonance of family and community in her aunt's house, listening to a tune that has been played in this kitchen often before, for hundreds of years. The novel insists that nothing is truly foreign, that there is no real border between outside and inside, that the house need not be a stagnant fortress, keeping the family in or outsiders out. Indeed, like the Gaeltacht, both foreign and central to Irishness, the Irish language is foreign and not, the first official national language, but no longer the mother tongue of most Irish citizens. The narrator initially notes of Orla's host mother that she might be another species, or at least a race, all of whose symbolism is foreign and impenetrable. But this impression is short-lived, and Orla quickly comes inside to the private space of her Banatee's house. Indeed, the Banatee is herself a foreigner, an Irish speaker from Scotland. Similarly, the north through which the children pass en route to Donegal is both foreign and not, as it is like having a foreign country sort of on your doorstep, one with Mars bars. By passing through and inhabiting these multiple spaces, Orla's identity becomes fluid rather than closed off, essentialist, or rigid. But then that is what much Irish women's literature posits identity to be. In drawing attention to the construction of, and then deconstructing, the quintessential Irish house and the woman of it, these postmodern novels are not just looking forward to Ireland's cosmopolitan future, but pointing out that Ireland, like Irishness, was never just about ourselves alone, locked in the house and peering out through the keyhole. To truly become an Irish woman, one must go out of the house. Thank you.
Good afternoon. You're going to find through this that there's a big list of writers. And so I did that because whenever I talk about Irish American women, people go, who? So I wanted to give you a list in case you want to write down any for reference. So, in 1998, I fell in love. Although I had published, presented papers, and earned tenure, I had never felt so academically enamored. The site was SIU-Carbondale at Charlie Fanning's Symposium on the Irish Diaspora. For 2 days, I listened, rapt, to intellectually challenging interdisciplinary research covering a range of topics. Intimidated but impressed, I longed to be part of this erudite group. I was also intrigued. As I listened to papers on Irish American uniqueness, imagination, and immigration, I learned about writers such as Don Byrne, Colin McCann, and Frank McCourt. I wondered, where are the Irish American women? Although Maureen Murphy had discussed depictions of the Irish servant girl, and Ellen Scarrett described the Irish in Chicago's Hull House neighborhood, no one addressed the works of Irish and Irish American women writers. I was hooked. This began a new phase in my academic research. For that, I am forever grateful to Charlie and his award-winning study, The Irish Voice in America. The 1990 edition was the first to identify and pay attention to a wide range of Irish American women writers and to acknowledge their roles in the development of the field. Okay, come on. Oh, here we go. Am I here? I am here. Okay. In addition to Mary Doyle Curran, Mary McCarthy, Maureen Howard, Elizabeth Cullinan, and Mary Gordon, Charlie mentioned Carol Rivers and discussed the works of Elizabeth Savage, Elaine Ford, Susanna Moore, Diana O'Hare, and Ellen Curry. In his second edition, he added Maura Stanton, Maury Rogers, Ann Beatty, Helen Mulcairns, Eileen Miles, Anna Quinlan, and Alice McDermott. Within the Irish Voice, I also found the terms which helped me define my subject. Fanning had concluded that writers may be characterized as Irish American if their work contained the following traits: the dominant mother in her fortress house, the first son marching off to priesthood, the convent-educated daughter playing the piano in the parlor, parochial schoolmates turning into leaders of young men's sodality or incorrigible criminals, lives organized around ideas of religion, family, nationhood for Ireland, hard work, home ownership, the rise to respectability, tableaus of ritual gatherings at deathbeds and christenings, weddings and wakes, the gift of humor and invective and public speech joined to an inability to express love and compassion in private, a penchant stylistically for formal experimentation, linguistic exuberance, and satiric modes. Other traits included Irish ancestry, personal and place names, semi-autobiographical tales, regional realism, Catholicism, the scourge of alcoholism, and plots hinging upon fatalism, forgiveness, and redemption. Armed with a reading list and essential definitions, I dove in. 4 years and many novels later, I felt confident enough to propose a paper for the Midwest Irish Studies Conference. I started with the Grande Dame, Mary McCarthy. While McCarthy carried on many of the Irish American literary traditions, she also updated them. In McCarthy's world, mothers had become their daughters' confidants,
Daughters were college-educated. They worked often in publishing. Single women were at times promiscuous. Married women sometimes adulterous. Motherhood was frustrating. Weddings perpetuated male dominance. Marriages ended in divorce. And religion was either rejected, intertwined with, or secondary to politics. If some of these themes sound familiar, it's because they run throughout Alice McDermott's novels. Indeed, her body of work epitomizes the best of Irish American literature. So today, I would like to introduce you to this literature by focusing on her novels. And apologies for any misreadings. McDermott's first two novels are set in the 1980s, a period of American theocracy taken to the extreme in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. McDermott adapts this mindset in A Bigamous Daughter and That Night. In the former, the protagonist, Elizabeth Connolly, works in publishing. This novel differs from McDermott's subsequent works, for it is full of funny stories about hapless authors. But it also introduces many of her ongoing themes: love, sex, marriage, and women's rights. Pondering her first date with a new man, Elizabeth realizes it has been, quote, almost a year since she's had anyone in her bed, because waking up with the feeling, oh shit, who's this, makes for wonderful jokes, but lousy mornings and lousy days. As her relationship develops, she compares it to her friends' marriages. Too often the wives feel that love is gone. Although Elizabeth tells her boss she wanted a career, not a job, what she really wants is true love. Love will come to you, she sighs. Love beyond anything. It will change your life forever. In other words, she is not so much a feminist as an idealist. More down-to-earth is McDermott's second novel, That Night. Here she turns the literary clock back to the 1950s to remind readers how pregnant, unwed teens were treated at mid-century, sent away to put their babies up for adoption with no thought of or recourse to abortion. At the same time, it slyly emphasizes the fact that most teens are too immature to be mothers. After giving up her baby and moving home, Sheila longs to get back to the boys. Running up to her room, she applies heavy makeup, teases her hair, slips on some bracelets. Quote, the sound of them, she knows, will reach the boys, make them turn away from their cars. She practices a slow, wise smile. She wants to love someone else. These 1980s novels subtly rejected Ronald Reagan's marching orders from the Heritage Foundation to push the clock back to 1954 in this country, a time when notions of true love prevailed. For most Irish-American women publishing in the 80s, such politics were important. Like McDermott, Susanna Moore, Erin McGraw, Bobby Ann Mason, Mary Gordon, Ellen Curry, Mary McGarry Morris, Joyce Carol Oates, Elizabeth Cullinan, Carol Rivers, Susan Minot, Jean McGarry, and Morris Stanton used their novels to push back. In the 90s, Elaine Showalter hailed that decade as a feminization of the literary market, thanks to an absolute burgeoning of first-rate women writers. This area was dominated by Irish-American women. Time magazine listed Mary McGarry Morris's A Dangerous Woman as one of the five best novels of the year, while her songs in Ordinary Time made the New York Times bestsellers list. The memoirist Lucy Greeley won the Whiting Writers Award, and the prolific Joyce Carol Oates was twice nominated for a Pulitzer. McDermott's At Weddings and Wakes was also a finalist for the Pulitzer. 7 years later, her novel Charming Billy won the National Book Award for Fiction. In addition to promoting women's issues, these novels were characterized by non-chronological narratives, multiple points of view, and non-traditional themes, almost all of them featuring divorced or unhappily married women and non-traditional mores and works by the usual subjects: Howard, Minot, Gordon, and Moore, plus Jacqueline Carey, Tess Gallagher, and Anna Quinlan. These traits were also key elements in McDermott's works. As its title suggests, At Weddings and Wakes is an amalgamation of Fanning's original definition of the Irish-American novel, with the dominant mother, lives organized around ideas of religion and family, the convent-educated daughter, gatherings at deathbeds, weddings, and wakes, the gift of humor and invective in public speech, joined to an inability to express love and compassion in private. Combined with McCarthy's updates, wherein mothers have become their daughters' confidants, motherhood is frustrating, and worst of all, weddings perpetuate male dominance. The narrator is one of the Daly children, a daughter, a regular among McDermott's narrators, who listens to her mother, her aunts, and their stepmother, and recounts their angry, eventually tearful interactions during her family's weekly pilgrimage into the city. The stepmother characterizes the stereotypical, martyred, manipulative Irish mother. Aunt May is a former nun. Aunt Agnes is an executive secretary devoted to misanthropy. Another spinster, Aunt Veronica, has descended into alcoholism. But the children's mother, the only married sister, believes she has suffered the most. "He's not the man I married," she wails. "I'm not having the kind of life I wanted," she laments. Ironically, only the arrival of her derided husband dries the women's tears. After this novel, as the nation moved toward the fin de siècle, McDermott's novels, like many of her peers, grew darker. The award-winning Charming Billy explores the role of faith in the life and death of the alcoholic Billy Lynch by tracing marital relationships between the key players. At the same time, the novel examines all facets of what some call the Irish flu, Billy's alcoholism, a trait subsumed within the Irish-American definition of incorrigible. Arriving out of a narrative formed around drunkenness, deception, and a touch of domestic violence, we gain insight into these couples' relationships and the bonds formed within the Irish-American community. Then came 9/11. For many Americans, the attack on the towers marked the end of an era. According to Susan Faluti's study, The Terror Dream, feminism was blamed. Worse, women were encouraged to stay home and be wives and mothers. This malaise could be seen in the spate of so-called Irish-American works, featuring romance, detective, and fantasy novels starring upper-middle-class spunky heroines who overcame all odds only to marry. The best example of these was Courtney Sullivan's Commencement, which unsuccessfully takes on Mary McCarthy's The Group by mirroring the plot while mocking women's rights. As one character laments, they recognized that they were the first generation of women whose struggle with choice had nothing to do with getting it and everything to do with having too much of it. There were so many options it just felt impossible and exhausting to pick the right ones. These post-feminist works were bookended by novels revealing a generation of young women declaring their independence, yet suffering from anger, depression, and low self-esteem. Again, although the author's surname suggests they were Irish-American, these novels lack the traditional elements, save for invective in public speech and a penchant for promiscuity. Luckily for the reputation of Irish-American literature, McDermott stepped into the breach. But her next novel did not toe the party line. Rather, it reflected Americans' post-9/11 heartache and despair. In Child of My Heart, McDermott moves away from her traditional urban settings and theme of faith, and away from the dominant mother, priest sons, convent-educated daughters, and parochial school classmates. Lives are no longer organized around ideas of religion, family, hard work, home ownership, and respectability. Instead, she transports her characters from their ethnic urban enclave to the sterile safety of the East Hamptons. But this novel is not about the innocence of childhood or the purity of nature. Although it is set in a beautiful rural locale, it stands in sharp contrast to the prevailing theme of death, the primary link to Fanning's original definitions, and the sexual abandon implied in McCarthy's. Unlike Charming Billy, here death is presented not as a cause for celebration of the afterlife, but as stark and inevitable. Nature has supplanted religion. Love and morality have been displaced by dispassionate curiosity, if not cynicism. In this, McDermott was initially an outlier, for a surprising number of Irish-American writers, including Erin McGraw and Lisa Carey, returned their characters to the church after 9/11. McDermott's 2006 novel, After This, represents a cautious step in that direction. Here she steps back and moves back in literary time to the mid-20th century Irish-American enclave of Long Island to trace the growth of a family as it moves through the century and its changing mores. This setting allows McDermott to explore issues of sexuality and parenthood through their daughter's unwed pregnancy and consideration of abortion. She examines the cultural expectations surrounding motherhood and the restrictions of patriarchy, repeating early themes of family, parenthood, and Catholicism, while demonstrating the many changes that have occurred in the church and society. Ultimately, McDermott concludes that while many things have changed, two things are eternal: faith and family. Her next novel, Someone, winner of the Publisher's Weekly Best Fiction Book of the Year, Kirkus Review's Best Fiction, New York and Washington Post Notable Fiction, and NPR Best Book of 2013, reprises these themes in Brooklyn, whereas The Ninth Hour entwined laic families and nuns in early 20th century New York. These traditions have been carried on by newer Irish American writers such as Tracy O'Hare Lang, Jennifer Close, and Mary Beth Keane. Lang's debut novel, We Are the Brennans, tells the story of the 4 Brennan siblings and their adopted brother, a second-generation blue-collar Irish-American family who mostly lived together in a big house and co-own a bar. One brother and sister, her Irish twin, are alcoholics. One brother is a cop. The other runs a family bar. Despite secrets, the ubiquitous lack of communication, and numerous unforgiven slights, the family remains loyal, welcoming home their prodigal sister, quote, a missing piece of the family, come back into the fold after so many years, unquote, and forgiving their adopted brother for, quote, marrying outside the tribe. Likewise, Jennifer Close's Marrying the Ketchups, which is really the Brennan's doppelganger, is a story about the close-knit O'Sullivan family, subtle and manipulative with a heavy dash of guilt and good at avoidance, who also own a bar. Toward the end, this novel returns to its roots through allusions to the church. Although the family believes it is done with religion, one sister knows, this part of being Catholic was stuck with her forever. Similarly, although her brother also claims to have given up on the church, he regularly gives himself confession, detailing all his sins. He knew on some level that this was very effed up, but Catholicism had rooted itself so deeply in his bones that he couldn't shake it. Unlike Lang and Close, Mary Beth Keane has consistently pursued Irish-American themes. In The Walking People, she traces the journey of 2 Irish immigrants from their homeland to America. Mary Gordon praised this book as a marvel of ingenuity and accomplishment. Fever tells a story about the mistreatment of the Irish-American immigrant known as Typhoid Mary. While Ask Again Yes returns to the themes of family loyalty and forgiveness, marriage and betrayal, combining what one reviewer describes as, quote, Joan Didion's exacting eye for detail with the emotional wallop of Alice McDermott. These works not only reflect McDermott's influence, but also confirm that the Irish-American novel continues. And then came Absolution, which debuted in America as America is riven by anger, deceit, and dissension. As McDermott explained in an interview, its title and setting arose from her belief that our country's immoral involvement in Vietnam required a universal need for absolution. She got the idea for the book when she was an undergraduate reading Graham Greene's Vietnam novel, The Quiet American. Commenting on how Greene treated his female characters, McDermott notes that whereas his characterizations typified the 50s, and, quote, although he was politically prescient in writing about U.S. involvement in the war, he sure as hell didn't know what was coming for women, unquote. While Greene's male characters are fully developed, he depicts 2 young women as merely flat, clean, and uncomplicated. However, after meeting many women like them in subsequent years, McDermott realized that they were anything but simple. Absolution was her opportunity to let these women have their say, but not as they existed in the 60s. Rather, she explains that absolution can be read as a faux memoir. As in Child of Mine Heart, the narrator is looking back, hence the mature, somewhat jaundiced point of view. When the novel begins, it is 1963 in war-torn Saigon. I hope I'm not doing a lot of spoilers here for those who just bought the book. I don't think I am. Although this setting differs from McDermott's previous New York novels, it otherwise bears many similarities. Tricia Riordan is the newlywed wife of Peter Kelly, Irish Catholics from Yonkers educated in parochial schools. At the outset, Tricia's only desire is to be a helpmeet for her husband, ostensibly an engineer who's been recruited by the CIA. Indeed, Peter admits that the CIA, which was known then as the Catholic Intelligence Agency, specifically targeted Catholics, for who better understood the threat of godless communism. As Tricia says, I guess you could say our sense that we were part of the one true faith was pretty solid in those days. Or maybe I should say that mine was solid because I so trusted my husband to be right. Her friend Charlene, who initiates the action, is the pushy New York Episcopalian wife of a lawyer/spy who nevertheless wants to repair the world and alleviate suffering. They want to do good. And they do, by distributing gifts to the Vietnamese children and comforting the maimed. In other words, true to the traditions of the Irish-American novel, established by Fanning and updated by McCarthy, although the setting is alien, the main characters are college-educated, sometimes adulterous, submissive women guided by their Irish-American beliefs in lives organized around ideas of family and religion, and their Catholic beliefs and social justice. Here, religion and politics are intertwined, but you'll have to read the rest. Referring to the Irish-American novel, William Kennedy once said, "These traits endure." That is evident in the above works through the efforts of Irish-American women to give their female characters a voice and a mind of their own. Thank you, Alice McDermott, for carrying on this tradition. Thank you.